This is our best guess for what went down in the Taupo volcanic eruption. In this eruption, which was one of the largest in recorded human history, pumice from the eruption was so thick that it killed many people who were out at sea, suffocating them with each wave that crashed over them. But did it really happen like this? Well, it depends on how much of what we've heard about this event is actually true. And today we're going to find out the truth behind volcanic eruptions, because some things that we think are true are actually false, like really, really false. It all starts with this. Just before 1 a.m. on June 19, 1859, residents in New Zealand felt the ground shake beneath their feet. For 3 hours they watched as pumice and ash rained down from the sky, eventually covering the entire landscape in a layer of pumice more than 10 feet thick. Then just as suddenly as it started, the eruption stopped. So far, so good. This is more or less the consensus of what happened at the Taupo volcanic eruption. But then things get weird. According to a number of sources, after the initial eruption there was a second eruption the following day. However, this isn't mentioned in any official sources and geologists have no idea where it came from. It might be apocryphal, but if it did happen, it would make sense that no one knew because pumice from the first eruption was still falling from the sky when the second eruption occurred. It seems likely that people on the ground simply didn't know how to process what they were seeing. You see, when you hear about a volcanic eruption, you probably imagine something like Mount St. Helens. When it erupted in 1980, it sent a plume of ash and gas 12 miles into the air, followed by a cloud of hot gas and pumice that raced down the mountainside. This is called a pyroclastic flow, and it's a lot like a lava flow, in that it's hot, fast-moving, and dangerous as hell. But unlike a lava flow, which is made of molten rock, a pyroclastic flow is made of solid rock fragments and hot gas, and it's these pyroclastic flows that do the majority of damage during volcanic eruptions. But the Taupo eruption wasn't like that at all. There were no pyroclastic flows, which makes it unlike pretty much every other large volcanic eruption. Instead, pumice fell from the sky in what's known as a Vulcanian eruption. These are relatively rare and can be difficult to predict because they don't follow the same patterns as more common eruptions. Because they involve explosive decompression rather than the buildup of pressure, sometimes this is referred to as a popcorn eruption because it looks a little like popping corn. The reason pumice falls from the sky is because of dissolved gases within the magma. Magma contains lots of water vapor, and when it begins to rise, the pressure drops, which forms bubbles. As these bubbles expand, the magma becomes less dense and eventually, the buoyant magma and gas mixture floats to the surface. Once it reaches the surface, the rising pressure causes the bubbles to collapse, which creates small explosions that hurtle solid fragments of rock into the air. These fragments are called tephra, and they range in size from very fine ash particles to large blocks. In the case of the Taupo eruption, tephra fell over an area of approximately 2,600 square miles, much of which was over water. Some of the pumice landed in the ocean, but some of it also floated out to sea. Here's where things start to get weird. According to some reports, waves as tall as 100 feet rose and fell around boats and ships anchored offshore, killing several sailors and dragging others under the waves. Several ships were lost, including the 370-ton Tory, which was last seen at 5:30 a.m. on June 11th, anchored 14 miles off White Island. Another ship was discovered capsized 20 miles north of Great Barrier Island. And at least 2 other vessels were swamped and abandoned. In total, at least 156 people died. This sounds pretty bad, but it's also kind of ridiculous. 100-foot waves? Yeah, that doesn't sound plausible. In fact, it doesn't sound physically possible. To understand why, let's take a look at some real tsunamis. In 2004, a 9.1 magnitude earthquake struck off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia. It unleashed a series of tsunamis that barreled toward the coast at between 450 and 550 miles per hour. These waves were up to 100 feet tall when they hit land. In 2011, an 8.9 magnitude earthquake struck off the coast of Tohoku, Japan. It generated a series of tsunamis that were between 72 and 115 feet tall when they reached land. Now let's compare those to the waves generated by the Taupo eruption. The largest waves generated by the eruption were 6.6 feet tall, which is about half the height of LeBron James. Now obviously it's not a competition, but I think you can see where I'm going with this. A 100-foot wave caused by the eruption just isn't physically possible. So where did this figure come from? Well, it comes from a report written by an American naval officer named USS Stewart. He was on board the USS Macedonian when he witnessed the eruption from 16 miles away. He reported that the sea rose and fell around his ship, and that waves as tall as 100 feet rolled across the horizon. However, Stewart was only describing what he saw from afar, and he admitted that he couldn't determine the wave heights accurately. Geologists now believe that the waves were probably closer to 33 feet tall, which is still pretty big. In fact, scientists believe that the eruption generated a full-on tsunami that traveled around the North Island of New Zealand, which is roughly 500 miles long. That said, the tsunami generated by the eruption was about 10 times smaller than the tsunami generated by the earthquake that struck off the coast of Indonesia. So how exactly did the pumice kill sailors? Well, it didn't exactly suffocate them. You see, the pumice that fell from the sky contained about 70% water and 30% glass. So it's not like choking on a mouthful of pumice would kill someone. However, getting pumice in your clothes and shoes could weigh someone down, making it difficult to stay upright in a boat. If you were on a ship and the waves kept crashing over you, it wouldn't be long before you were exhausted. Eventually you'd fall into the water and drown. If you were on a small boat, it could easily capsize, especially if the weight of the pumice made it difficult to keep upright. And if you were on a larger vessel, the pumice could eventually sink it. When pumice accumulates on a ship, it adds weight. If enough pumice builds up, it could eventually sink a ship, especially if the pumice is waterlogged. This is what happened to the Tory. It was a brigantine, which is a type of sailing ship with both square-rigged and fore and aft rigged sails on at least one mast. The ship was built in 1845 and was one of the most heavily laden vessels ever to visit New Zealand. At the time of the eruption, the Tory was anchored with a 24-hour supply of water, food, and fuel, but it was also carrying cargo. One of its holds was filled with potatoes that were intended to be sold in Auckland, and on board were several barrels of sperm oil and sperm candle wick. The ship was also loaded with cargo for Sydney, Australia, including sheep and whalebone, and then there was the crew. At the time of the eruption, the Tory had a crew of 9 men and 8 passengers. All told, the ship was carrying more than 2/3 of a ton of cargo and supplies and between 9 and 17 people. Scientists believe that the weight of the pumice ultimately caused the Tory to sink. According to one account, the Tory was last seen at 5:30 a.m. on June 11th, anchored 14 miles off White Island with 7 crew members on board. The ship's captain, Charles Petley, wrote a letter to his wife shortly before the eruption, and it was later found in the wreckage of his ship. In the letter, he described how he and his crew were watching as pumice rained down from the sky. He said that the pumice landed on deck at a rate of 100 bushels an hour, and that the crew had spent all night bailing out water. He also said that their ship was beginning to leak, so they were forced to abandon the ship. His final words were, "I have just received orders to leave the ship immediately, so I must close my letter. I hope we get through safe. Our provisions and water are all right. God damn the Tory." And safe they did not get. There has never been a conclusive account of what happened to the men once they left the Tory, though. It's possible that they drowned after being pumice-napped, or that they were killed by the waves that Stewart described. Either way, the death toll associated with the Taupo eruption was almost certainly lower than 156. It's possible that some of the ships that went missing during the eruption weren't pumice-napped or capsized by giant waves, but rather were caught in the current generated by the tsunami that followed the eruption. The current could have carried ships and their crews hundreds of miles away from New Zealand, though nobody knows exactly where they ended up. Today it's impossible to say exactly how many people died as a result of the Taupo eruption. Some people probably drowned while trying to save their cargo. Others may have been swept up by the current and carried out to sea, and others still may have simply disappeared below the waves. We may never know what happened to them, but that won't stop us from telling their stories. Hopefully you learned something new today. If you did, please take a second to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thanks for watching. Thanks for